In Magic the Gathering, equipment is an artifact subtype. Artifacts with this subtype can be equipped to a creature by paying their equip cost, at which point they augment the equipped creature in one way or another. Originally introduced in 2003's Mirrodin, equipment have gone on to become an important part of Magic, with several of them featured in every set, and they often make an impact on the highest level of competitive Magic. If you're curious what equipment have been the most effective in tournament Magic, I do have a top 10 about that. But in this video I want to look at the opposite, 10 equipment that aren't worth playing in any format, whether they be 40 card, 60 card, or 100 card formats. While there is a lot of good equipment out there, there is also quite a lot of bad equipment out there because the very nature of the subtype kind of puts it behind the 8-ball. That's because most of them don't impact the board until you pay an equip cost, so if they are just a little expensive to cast or to equip, they can be pretty bad, but the equipment in this video are the worst of the worst. I've actually looked at Magic's worst equipment before, but it was more than 7 years ago, and these days the quality of my videos and the research I conduct to make them is a lot better, so I thought it was worth taking another look at this. In all, there are 588 equipment in Magic, and in this video I'll give you my pick for the 10 worst ones ever printed. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. At number 10, it's Hankyu. For 1 generic mana and an equip cost of 4, it gives the equipped creature the ability to tap and get an aim counter on the equipment. You can also tap it and remove all those aim counters from Hankyu to have that creature deal damage to target creature or player equal to the number of aim counters removed. In other words, Hankyu doesn't improve your creature's stats ever, and that's absolutely brutal for an equipment that costs 4 to put on something, and the ability it does give the creature is incredibly slow too. Basically, it takes forever to build up counters on Hankyu, and it takes an absurd amount of counters for this to ever be worth the investment, and this is especially true when you have to keep on moving Hankyu to new creatures to continue to build up counters on it. You know what works way better for winning games? Spending all that mana on other creatures and attacking with those creatures instead of putting little fiddly counters on this equipment. As bad as this card is, I do think it's the least bad one on the list because there are some things you can do with it to make it better, like using the proliferate mechanic to build up counters on it, and while I don't really advise doing that since there are literally hundreds of better cards for you to put counters on, that does still mean this has a higher ceiling than the other cards on the list, which never really have situations where they can actually help you win the game. At number 9, it's Warlord's Axe. It costs 3 generic mana to cast and 4 generic mana to equip, and it gives +3/+1. Yeah, this one is not only super underpowered and inefficient, it's not even interesting to talk about. It just gives way too small of a boost when you spend 7 total mana. The meager toughness boost especially is super disappointing because it means your creature can still be traded for by something relatively small, and that means you have to spend 4 mana on this to put it on something else for it to ever make another impact on the board. Sinking a bunch of mana into this thing is a good way to lose a game of Magic. At number 8, I've got Healer's Headdress. For 2 generic mana and 1 generic to equip, the Headdress grants +0/+2 and allows the equipped creature to tap to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to target creature or player this turn. You can also pay 2 white mana to attach it to something, and that means you can move this around at instant speed if you pay that cost. This card is part of the same cycle as the super powerful Cranial Plating, a card that I don't think most people even know is part of a cycle, since the other cards in it are mediocre to bad, and this one is by far the worst. By the way, if you want to know more about some unbalanced cycles like this one, I have a top 10 about that. Anyway, this is a purely defensive equipment, and it's not even that good at being defensive. 2 toughness isn't a meaningful boost when you're paying this cost, and damage prevention effects like this are rarely meaningful. Moving it at instant speed can mean sometimes it does something out of nowhere, but it's not that easy to leave up 2 white mana every turn, and it'd be better to do something more meaningful with that mana anyway, and it's not like it's really out of nowhere. Your opponent knows you have the equipment on the battlefield. Some of the equipment on this list at least make a creature significantly better when it is equipped, even if it takes some work to get it equipped, but Healer's Headdress barely upgrades a creature at all, and certainly isn't worth a card or the mana. At number 7, it's Skyblinder Staff. For 1 generic and 3 to equip, it gives the equipped creature +1/+0, and it can't be blocked by creatures with flying. No, I didn't read that wrong. It doesn't say can only be blocked by creatures with flying, which would be substantially better. It definitely says can't be blocked by creatures with flying, and that is flavorful since the idea is that you're blinding those flyers. Yeah, Skyblinder Staff may be super cheap to cast, but paying 3 for a meager power boost and an incredibly narrow form of evasion is terrible. There aren't that many decks out there that only run flyers, and even in that dream matchup for this card, it isn't like spending 4 total mana to buff a creature with this is all that meaningful. One of the nice things about equipment is that it can help make an insignificant creature much more relevant, but a card like this needs that creature to already be good, because getting in with some small creature every turn while your opponent is smashing you in the air with flyers isn't really going to help you win the race. At number 6, it's Gate Smasher. It costs 3 generic to cast and 3 to equip, but it can only be attached to a creature with toughness 4 or greater. You would think an equipment with that restriction and these expensive costs would give a significant buff, but it really doesn't. It gives +3/+0 and trample, and that's it. Only being able to put this on a high toughness creature does mean that it's going to be a pretty beefy creature since its toughness is already high, but you're still way overpaying here. And this isn't even a power creep type thing. The very first set with equipment had Loxodon Warhammer. Same casting cost and equip cost, but it can be equipped to anything, and it grants the same stats boost and trample as well as lifelink. The Warhammer is just a million times better than the Smasher is, and even though Tarkir Draft did have a high toughness deck, this was not the payoff you were looking for. As I mentioned in the intro, one of the biggest problems with equipment is that most of them don't impact the board until you equip them, so when you do equip them, they have to do something big. None of the cards on this list really do that, but at least the others don't have a restriction when it comes to what they can be equipped to, making it even more likely that you can't do anything with this card. I just told you about Gate Smasher, and I want to ask you to smash something too, the subscribe button. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I could use your help in getting there. Even if you think you're already subscribed, do me a favor and double check because more than half of my viewers aren't subscribed. At number 5, it's Siren Song Lyre. For 2 generic to cast and 2 to equip, it gives the equipped creature an activated ability that requires 2 mana and you tap the creature to tap target creature. So this is kind of like Healer's Headdress, but worse since it's even higher on the list obviously. It doesn't offer any stats boost at all and gives the equipped creature a very mediocre ability, and it only taps its first thing after you've sunk a total of 6 mana into it. It does get a little more efficient the longer you use it, and it's kind of cute that you can move it to another creature and use the ability again in the same turn, but you're basically flushing your mana down a toilet if that's your game plan. There are some payoffs out there for tapping creatures that can make this slightly better, but there are lots of ways to tap creatures that don't use up an entire card and grant a very underwhelming ability. Tapping creatures can feel good sometimes, but at its best it's like removal that you have to pay for every turn, and it doesn't even entirely deal with creatures that are interested in doing something other than attacking or blocking, and there aren't that many creatures these days that are all about that life. Basically, this is a horrible way to spend your mana, and if you do it enough in lieu of actually adding to the board, you're almost guaranteeing that you're going to lose the game. At number 4, it's Grifter's Blade. For 3 generic mana and 1 to equip, it's an equipment with Flash. It attaches to a creature you control when it enters, and the equipped creature gets +1/+1. So, without Flash, 3 mana to play and 1 to equip for this boost is not a good rate. The equip cost isn't terrible, but 3 mana is way too much to cast it in the first place. And the fact it can operate as a bad combat trick that sticks around doesn't really make a big difference. I mean, you spend 3 times the mana for Giant Growth for 1/3 the buff. And yes, in this case the buff sticks around and can be moved around, but I think we can all agree that you're overpaying in a big way for a buff that doesn't even help your creature punch above its weight class in any meaningful way. While this card is terrible, it is an important one in the history of equipment design because it did a couple of things for the first time, and since then they've found ways to implement them more effectively. For one thing, it was the first equipment that attaches to a creature for free when it enters. Adding this to the card helps it get around the "my equipment doesn't add to the board unless I pay some more mana" problem. It was also the first equipment with Flash, which when combined with the first part means this can work like a bad combat trick. Basically, Grifter's Blade had to walk for Embercleave to run. But as bad as Grifter's Blade and the other cards we've talked about are, the top 3 on this list are truly in their very own horrendous tier because trying to use them will actively lead to you losing the game, and not just because they're inefficient. They also all have massive drawbacks. Like our number 3 card, Heavy Arbalest. For 3 generic to cast and 4 to equip, it makes it so the equipped creature doesn't untap during its untap step, but it can tap and do 2 damage to any target. That second part is actually really good. Equipment that lets a creature tap to just do 1 damage plays pretty well, especially with Death Touch, and Heavy Arbalest does twice the damage. But the huge casting and equip cost, coupled with the massive downside of your creature not untapping, makes it so that really doesn't matter. I mean, you spend 7 total mana to do 2 damage with this thing, and that's already not very efficient. And if you're spending that much mana, you definitely deserve for that creature to untap as normal. It's not like this card would be nuts without that downside. It would be good for sure, but no one would think it was broken since it's so clunky. But as is, you have to endure a horrible downside when you can only get around by moving this to other creatures, which costs an absurd amount of mana, just so you aren't completely hamstrung by this thing. And in reality, paying all that mana just to move it around is going to hamstring you pretty hard too. At number 2, it's Thirsting Axe. For 3 generic to play and 2 to equip, it gives the equipped creature +4/+0. Let's stop there real quick. Would that card be good? No. In fact, a card that offered that buff with a small downside was the number 11 card for this list, Enormous Energy Blade, but in the end I decided the 10 equipment on this list are even worse than it is. And sure, it's the kind of buff that is nice on like a big flyer, especially with lifelink, and it can even make tokens into decent threats, but it's not the kind of card that would see regular play in any format. But this is way worse than the Energy Blade because it has a colossal downside. At the beginning of your end step, if the equipped creature didn't deal combat damage to a creature this turn, you sacrifice it. Yeah, that's terrible. 99% of the time, your opponent has complete control over whether or not you do combat damage to their creatures, so they can just let the damage through, in which case you're allowing them to pay life and not use any cards to cast a removal spell, and in fact, it's kind of like a removal spell you spent mana on. Sure, every now and then you can put this on something that your opponent absolutely has to block, but that's a very narrow situation, and most of the time you're going to end up super far behind, even if you are doing 4 extra damage to them, since you gave up a whole card and have to spend mana to do it all over again. It's kind of like the world's worst Lava Axe. That's just not a good way to use up your main resources, your creatures, and your mana. The fact this is barely played in EDH, despite the fact that sacrifice decks and commander damage are a thing, really drives home the point that this card is terrible, since even in decks with the right synergy for it aren't interested in using it. But there's one even worse equipment out there, and I honestly think it's the worst equipment by a super wide margin, and that card is Razor Boomerang. For 3 generic and 2 to equip, it gives the equipped creature the ability to tap to do 1 damage to any target, but only if you unattach Razor Boomerang. We could stop there and this card would be bad, since you have to spend the 2 mana again just to do the 1 damage again, but it gets even worse, believe it or not, because the Boomerang also returns to your hand. And that means you have to spend 5 mana every time you want to do 1 damage with this, while also having to tap your freaking creature. This is definitely the kind of card where someone designed it and they were like, man, this is perfect flavor for a Boomerang, and I would agree with them, but the end result is a terrible card. It's not worth spending all of that mana to do 1 damage at a time, even in a deck that gets value for casting artifacts or equipment or something. Like Thirsting Axe, even though there are decks that have synergy for those things, none of them are playing this absolutely horrendous card, which I think is the worst equipment ever printed in Magic the Gathering. So those are my picks for the worst equipment we've ever seen. If you want to own any of these cards because maybe you like actively lowering your win rate, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s and other Magic videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the over 900 MTG Top 10s that are already out there, including dozens that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.